My name is Elisha Kindamba. I am the founder of Semansa Academic and Counseling Program. And today I'll give a brief introduction of what the Semansa Academic and Counseling Program does. The Semansa and Academic Counseling Program is a special initiative that we have to help people restore and cultivate successful human relationship. We believe that there is nothing important to human like his relationship, and we also have come to a conclusion that before we talk of personal and national success, the only success we have to begin speaking of is relationship success. In other words, before you seek of life success, the first success you have to look for is in relationship. Today, in the world we live in, we have more than 7.5 billion people. In our country specifically, we have more than 5.8 million. And despite of this daily increasing population, we have only 4 types of human relationship. The number 1 type of human relationship is spiritual relationship. This is a relationship a human has with his creator or the one who sourced him. And relationship number 2 is the environmental relationship. This is an interaction a human has with the natural and the artificial environment. Relationship number 3 is the personal relationship. This is where a human being interacts with himself. And finally, we have interpersonal relationship. This is an area of human interaction where he gets to interact with other people in marriage, in business, in politics, and in all other areas of human relationship. Again, our world has several types of relationships. However, the Semansa Academic and Counseling Program is dedicated to human relationship, and the reason for that is simple. We believe that every human is valuable, and the human is the most valuable resource. And therefore, as a country, if we effectively invest in the human resource, development to our nations become a talk of the day. I also believe that countries have systems that help the countries run. However, I believe that for these countries and their systems to effectively operate, there should be 6 basic elements that are necessary, and they should be applied for these countries to effectively run. Number 1 element is ecclesia. Ecclesia is a group of people who derive their identity from their creator, from their source. They also, their internal motivation is driven by the laws of God himself. That's the first and basic element. Element number 2 is contribution. Contribution is a discovered service that one provides for the betterment of other people and for the welfare of the nation. Element number 3 is character. Character encompasses, actually includes the inbuilt habits one has, and these are the habits that control his interactions. Number 4, every country and every person needs leadership. Leadership is a process of discovering, organizing, and executing your service for the betterment of other people and for the welfare of the nation. Number 5. Number 5 is the most important. Number 5 is the aspect of relationship. A relationship that I'm speaking here of actually is based on what I just said. Relationship at spiritual level, at environmental level, personal and interpersonal level. And finally, every person needs truth. Today, our major focus of discussion is revisiting and effectively investing in the informal education system. Today I want to talk about how informal education is really necessary to cultivate nations' success. Every nation is actually contributed to by several factors for it to guarantee its success. And one among the most leading factors of national success is the education system. And this is actually the basis of the thinking of the people in the society, and the thinking of the people actually predetermines the way people participate and engage actively into the development process. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the basis of national success is its education system. In other words, the education system produces the thinking of the people, and the thinking of the people produces the level unto which these people participate into the national development process. Now, one among the most missing elements in today's success process is people's participation. In my country, Tanzania, when you speak of people's participation, the early idea people get is their contribution to the government through taxation. However, my talk has nothing to do with taxation. My talk has to do with this specific contribution which a person has for the benefit of other people and for the welfare of his nation. Today I want to take you to a little history of our education and show you that our country does not have its education, and yet the only way to be successful as a nation is to have our own education system. Now, before I take you to that history, it is important that I explain to you that every education system has only 2 purposes. The first purpose of the education system is, number one, to give identity to the people who are educated by that education system. And number two is to inculcate or to cultivate or to invest a spirit into these people of being useful members of the society. In other words, the first thing is giving people identity, and number two is making these people become useful to the society. Now, in our Tanzanian history, of course, in the years of 1868, our country did not have its own education system. Why? Because we already had an interference of the missionaries. However, before 1868, our country was not a country. It was actually a landmass occupied by several tribes, and therefore the education system we had before was actually based on tribal education, and the elders did a lot of job to help the youths to become useful members of the society. So in the years of 1868, before that, actually before 1868, we had elders taking youths to places of work, teaching them to become useful people to the society, teaching them on how they should become men, how to do with agriculture, and how to participate in various society activities. However, with the coming of missionaries, we see the introduction of spiritual education. Even though we do not have a lot of history that talks about how missionaries brought their education in 1868 until 1886. But what we know is that in the year 1896, after the Berlin Conference, this country was occupied. Actually, was given it was guaranteed to Germany to occupy this nation. Now, after Germany occupied this nation came under the education of the German. Now, Germany was using his education to produce people who would fit his system. In discussing the role of informal education in our country today, it is important to go back and learn our history of where really did we have what we call informal education and how necessary it was in propelling or bringing about national development. Our history of informal education actually gets to its climax in the 1868, where we see in those years we have now missionaries coming to this land. We cannot call it a country or a state, because by that time it was simply a land. However, before 1868, this is the time where we had tribal education taking the lead. Now, tribal education was one among the most successful educations we had in this land, which we today call Tanzania. Why is that so? That is so because in these communities actually, the situation that happened to the youths is that the elders were educating the youths, preparing them to identify themselves as useful members of the communities and contributed members. So they were not just members, but they were members who identified themselves as members of the community, and they also identified their responsibility in the community. And therefore, if we once had a successful education, that was the tribal education, because it was our education. It educated young people, preparing them to become successful, contributive members of the social and economic development of the society by then. However, by the intervention now of the missionaries in the 1868, we now see coming in of a new education system, which is now a spiritual education. This education is not really aimed at preparing people to become successful and useful people to the society. Rather, it prepares them to just have a fear of the Lord and people who believe that they were created by the Lord, which is excellent, of course. However, the weakness was it was not centered in preparing the Africans at that time to become successful contributors of their national development. Later, we had the coming in this country by 1886 of the Germany troops, and of course the Germany leadership or colonial master, and he comes and he introduces education, but the education is actually focused in creating people who will be useful to the colonial intent. Remember, I told you that education has only two purposes. Number one is to give identification to people. Number two is to make these people become of contribution to their society. Now, Germany introduces an education with the very same intent. The intent is to make people have a recognition, to identify themselves as of the Germany culture, and also to work for the betterment of the Germany colonial master. Later, we see the coming in of British in the year of 1916, actually after the end of the First World War. We see now British coming in the country and defines existing classes of people who are educated. However, British also establishes an education system. The system that British establishes is also having the same intent with Germany. Now, the system also propels people to learn the culture of the British and to also work for the intents of the colonial master. So in other words, we see from the year 1868 until 1960, where we had Germany now finalizing the preparations for independence of this country, which we today call Tanzania, we see it is like a total sum of more than 100 years. In other words, from 1868, where we see the coming in of missionaries, until 1960, where Tanzania is, where actually the today so-called Tanzania is preparing to attain its independence, we have 92 years where we experience not an education that prepares Tanzanians to identify themselves and love themselves being Tanzanians and invest or contribute to the national success, but an education that prepares them to fit the desires of the colonial masters together with the missionary intent. Therefore, until we got independence in 1961, we see President Nyerere establishing now what we call public education. Public education, it was actually, we can give it a rough run from 1961 to 1966. In this time, the education was actually aimed making all schools that were private, making them public, and cancelling school fees in all schools. Why was that done? Because Nyerere was having intent of making people get education. All people without their historical background, their family, nature, and all these other qualities. However, in 1967, we had another wonderful and outstanding historical phenomena in our country. In 1967, we have what we call the Arusha Declaration. Now, the Arusha Declaration brings in a concept called education for self-reliance. At this time, we see now the president himself propagating people to understand that education is meant to set people free and make them become the people who produce success in their own country. Now, at this time, in the universities, it was easy to have statements like, you have a debt to the society. Why? Because the society actually sponsored the educated people, and the educated people had the responsibility to return back and invest or help the community develop. As we speak today, as we speak in our country today, one among the most missing elements in our development process is the understanding that people or individual citizens are responsible for their national development. And I came to a conclusion that this has no other reason. Many of the people believe that for a country to develop, people should have a good education system. And when they speak of education system, most of them speak of the formal education system. However, according to me, I have come to realize the formal education that we expected to bring in people who are self-sufficient people, we came to realize that it develops people who are selfish and non-sufficient people. This is why we have a country with people who do not have an attitude of nationalism, people who are not patriotic. This is because the education system we have only produces professionals. It doesn't educate them on how they should respond to the national problems. This is why I therefore came to a conclusion of bringing this education to the Tanzanian community again. The only way to solve the plight of non-responsible citizens in our country is by developing a serious informal educative system which takes back the idea that every person in a country has a responsibility. Despite of his level of education, despite of his historical background, he has a responsibility towards national development processes. Now, if we study this thing critically, we shall realize that currently we are having several universities in our country, and the University of Dar es Salaam being the lead, of course. And we, according to the UniRank statistics, University of Dar es Salaam is expected to have an enrollment of more than 150,000 students annually. Now, these statistics should give you a conclusion that it means there is a production of many formal educated persons, but the only missing element in our country is the formal educated people do not have that zeal, do not have that feeling do not have this mentality, do not have this thinking that they have a responsibility to spearhead national development. Now, why should we really focus on the informal education? I was listening to the statistics of our country, and it is said that we invest more than 16% of our annual budget in education itself. And the 16% is invested in the formal education. But surprisingly, I made my personal assessment and I realized that more than 90% of the students' time is invested in entertainment. Many people are interested in sports. Many people are interested in movies and music. Many people are interested in making stories discussing about the conflict of politics in the country. These are the issues that people are circulated with. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that, in other words, as the country focuses in investing in the formal education, much of the thinking of the people in our country is controlled by the informal education. Many people become serious when they are in class. Many people become serious when they're preparing for exams. Now, this could be a habit in many places, but in reference to my country, I'm simply saying it is evidence that we have not successfully brought up our aim to develop people who will become of value to the nation. The question is therefore, why do I believe that as a country we should revisit and reinvest in the informal education? My belief in the revisiting and investment in the informal education is that it is the most serious education that controls the thinking of the people in our country today. Our country has a population of more than 58 million. And I was looking at the statistics and I realized that before, actually in 1967, our population was less than 12 million. Then in 2012, after we held the census, our population was less than 45 million. Then today, as we speak, our country has more than 58 million people circulated all over the country. But if you critically study the population and its conversation, its interaction, you will soon realize that the people are controlled not by the formal education we give them in class. They are controlled by the informal education, where we find informations that are not from class, but information from the television, from the internet, from the WhatsApp, from the Facebook, from all these other social medias. People are saturated with information from the conferences and from all these kind of other informal ways of getting education. Therefore, if we have to develop a spirit of people getting engaged into social contribution, focusing into the development of their nation, the only way to do that is not through formal education, because formal education will always produce people who are exact like the system. And it actually produces people who are selfish. They are looking for jobs, they are looking for money. But informal education can easily help us get this thing to the mentality of most of the Tanzanians, that we are now seeking for a community that is looking forward for the development of other people and for the welfare of the nation. So coming to a conclusion to what we have to discuss today, I want to remind you that our country is a serious country, and it is a country that has a lot of resources. And one among the most serious resources we have in this country is the human resource. And the easiest way to develop the human resource is by revisiting and reinvesting in the informal education. Why? Because today the informal education runs the thinking of the people in our country. And if we have to seek for success, the music system has to be used for the betterment of other people and for the welfare of the country. If we have to seek for success, the conferences that we arrange have to be based on making people understand their responsibility as citizens in this country and their obligation to make sure that the country becomes successful. I was looking at the situation we have in our villages, in some places people where we don't have water and all these lacking services. And people have a problem because informal education, actually not informal, formal education prepares people to get jobs. And when they miss the jobs, they say the government is not preparing jobs. And the question is, why aren't people preparing themselves to become responsible citizens in their communities? Why aren't they thinking? Why aren't they developing ideas? This is because we have not centered ourselves in teaching people that they have a responsibility to contribute to the welfare of this nation. I therefore invite you to keep on visiting and study and learn from our programs, because as you become a contributor, you also execute it for the welfare of other people and for the betterment of your nation. Welcome.